Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us at the next in the IAA series of Fireside Chats. The IAA is an organization that is not focused on a particular segment of the advertising industry, but instead looks at the advertising industry as a whole and sort of asks, how do we make the ecosystem better? And one of the ways that we do that is through the IAA's Public Policy Council, where we try to do a bunch of different things to support the advertising industry. One of them is educational, and some of them is advocacy, and some of them is just focusing on the support of collaboration between various stakeholders in the advertising industry. We've been doing a series of fireside chats now for a couple of years, talking to all different types of people who are playing some role in the advertising ecosystem. Everyone from regulators in countries to self-regulatory systems around the world to other kinds of NGOs who are advocating for the adoption of different types of advertising principles and focusing on different types of issues. We've had interesting conversations with the UN and with the ICC and with so many people around the world. Anyway, so one of the fun things I think about being an advertising lawyer, and I'm an advertising lawyer, and as you can see by my name, I'm Jeff Greenbaum, and I am the chair of the Public Policy Council for the IAA. And one of the fun things about being an advertising lawyer is there's a community of people that do this, that many of whom have done it for many, many years. And there's a continuing conversation that goes on in all kinds of different fora about these types of issues. So I think of Mary Engle, who I'm happy to introduce to you now, who is, as you can see, sitting next to me before our pretend fireplace. Mary is Executive Vice President of Policy at BBB National Programs. But if she's not familiar to you in that role, she should also be familiar to you for the many years that she spent as head of ad practices at the FTC, among other roles. Anyway, Mary, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here.
But as I was saying, one of the, I think the fun things about sort of the practice of thinking about advertising law and consumer protection is it really is a continuing conversation. And I remember when I ended up kind of fortuitously as an advertising lawyer, I sort of had this idea that, oh, you'll learn it and then you can just do it. Like you become an expert and you can just do it. And if I could have predicted 25 years ago now, the pace of change and how the issues we are thinking about are so dramatically different than they were 25 years ago, it's pretty unbelievable. But also that in so many ways, we've all been thinking them through together very transparently. I think we all remember very well, there was I don't remember exactly what the context was. Here I am just free associating, but the context of, I remember you at an NAD conference, must have been 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. It must have been, I don't know, 2003. Yeah, it was right around the time when some release of a new version of the endorsement guides came out. And, and I remember it was this sort of moment of there's just all this new stuff happening. And, it was kind of like, all right, FTC, we're trying to figure it out too. Here's some guidance. We're going to think about it. We're going to start talking about it. And it was yet one of those incredible moments of just, dialogue and thinking about these. Anyway, we can talk more about that. Anyway, so my hope today is to talk about the U.S. advertising self-regulatory system a little bit, and sort of talk about the role that it plays in kind of the U.S. advertising ecosystem, and then also maybe talk about a little bit of your perspective now, having been outside of the FTC for a little while, and then sort of tie it in a little bit to sort of the way in which advertising self-regulation plays an important role, around the world. And so I don't know, with that long rambling introduction, I guess maybe we could just start with talking a little bit about, for people that are not familiar about it around the world, with sort of BBB National Programs and the programs, the sort of advertising self-regulatory programs that you guys run. And why don't we start from there?
Sure, absolutely. And yeah, just to respond to what you said earlier, when I started working at the FTC in advertising, there was no internet, it didn't exist yet. So there has been a lot of changes over the years. It's been fascinating to keep up with them all. But so BBB National Programs is a nonprofit organization dedicated to increasing marketplace trust. And we oversee about 18 different independent self-regulatory and accountability programs in the areas of advertising, privacy, and dispute resolution. And the advertising ones, the National Advertising Division, is actually our oldest program. It was created in 1971 as a voluntary forum for advertisers to resolve disputes over false advertising. And NAD also brings its own cases based on its own monitoring of the marketplace. So NAD is the oldest, the grand old lady of self-regulatory programs here. And then a few years after NAD was established, the Children's Advertising Review Unit was formed, dedicated, as it sounds, specifically to looking at advertising to young children, and actually issued guidelines for the appropriate advertising to the young audience. And so it actually looks at not just what might be misleading to kids, but what might be inappropriate to kids. And then there's the National Advertising Review Board, which is the appellate body for both NAD and KRU. So if an advertiser is not happy with the decision that either one of those passes down, they have the opportunity to appeal it to the NARB, and appeals are heard by a panel of five folks who come from the advertising community, from advertisers themselves, ad agencies, or marketing academics. And I think it's a wonderful part of the program that it provides this layer of credibility on top of the decisions that NAD makes, because it's like it's peer review, essentially, an independent review of the decisions. And then we have the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, which is quite a different model. This model was responding to concerns about childhood obesity levels, and the food and beverage advertisers got together and said, there's something we can do here. We can change, improve the landscape of food marketing to kids. And so the CFBAI is a pledge program where the companies that participate agree to only advertise foods that meet strict nutrition criteria, or not to advertise to children at all. And it started out with 10 companies, and now it's up to 20 companies. And then there's the Children's Confection Advertising Initiative, which is kind of like the little sister to the CFBAI. That's a program created specifically for smaller candy companies, essentially, and they all agree not to advertise to children at all. And then finally, our newest program is the Direct Selling Self-Regulatory Council. It's almost 4 years, will turn 4 this year. So growing out of the toddler years. And it was established by the direct selling industry to look specifically and monitor the direct selling or multi-level marketplace for misleading claims about earnings potential, how much money you can earn in the particular opportunity, but also misleading claims about the products that are being sold, whether it's a dietary supplement or other kind of product.
So maybe I want to talk a lot about NAD and some things going on there, and KRU as well. But I would love to just take a detour for a second and talk about pledge programs for a second, because it's such a completely different model, right? If one is about essentially truth and accuracy or appropriateness in advertising, this is really the pledge programs are really about changing the products themselves, right? And about changing the kind of, at least the Food and Beverage Initiative is, right? Do you see, and it was specifically, in the food and the candy space, do you see BBB National Programs sort of using that pledge model as a way to address other issues in the marketplace? Like, is this an area where you say, hey, we can do this in lots of different industries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it does have that potential for companies that are, really willing to step up to the plate and say, hey, we're going to commit publicly not to do this type of thing or to do this type of thing. One area that we're looking at right now actually is in the area of digital health privacy. So outside of the HIPAA context, outside of the healthcare industry, doctors, insurance companies, et cetera, there's all sorts of health data that's collected by apps, by wearables, by health websites, very much in the news lately. And it's not really protected by anything specific, right? There's the Federal Trade Commission Act, there's maybe a state law here or there, but there's not a specific program of privacy protection, data protection for that data. And that might be a good model for a self-regulatory pledge program where companies agree to abide by a framework of principles. Here's how we're going to show consumers that they can trust their data with us, and have it verified by BBB National Programs.
One of the interesting things about just talking about the medical privacy for a second, or the health privacy, in GoodRx, I think one of the the things that people are talking very focused on that issue, but one of the things people are not talking as much about are the allegations related to failing, the claims that GoodRx complied with the digital advertising alliance programs, and that in fact it was not Principles wasn't in fact doing that. And this issue has been one that has always been very, very interesting to me. This notion that complying with self-regulatory principles is voluntary, right? But that once you say you comply with those principles, if you actually don't do it, that in itself could be a false claim. And I think that sometimes people don't focus on those issues. I mean, I feel like this is maybe, there was a case many, many years ago, a video game case where the FTC, had those allegations, and then there was like a closing letter or something, but it's really only come up a couple of times. Do you see this as an area where, as these types of pledge programs become more important, as people adopt these types of principles, that that FTC is going to start to look at these more closely and say, hey, you don't think that just because these principles are voluntary that we're just going to let it go. We're actually going to hold you to these voluntary principles that you've agreed to comply with.
Yeah, no, I think in the GoodRx case is really interesting. Not only what you didn't mention, the FTC's application of the health breach notification rule, which is in an expansive interpretation that really should be a wake-up call to many health apps and others in this space. But with respect to the DAA statement, and that program is interesting because it's not a pledge program, but the DAA principles say every company that's in the digital advertising marketplace should affirmatively state that they comply. And the reason for that was to add some enforceability. So then you have a statement that could be enforceable by the Federal Trade Commission Act. It's a representation in commerce. And that part of the idea of that was to bring credibility to the program with respect to the FTC, with respect to the regulators, so that there would be some teeth behind it.
Well, I think that's a perfect transition to, credibility to regulators, teeth behind it. So I realize we were not there at the time, but I think it's interesting for people to hear, if you take us back to 1971 or the 70s, and just talk for a second about, why the NAD was created, what was happening at the FTC, what the view was, and what the role that sort of advertising regulation was supposed to play.
Yeah, actually, so when NAD celebrated its 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, we kind of looked into the archives and found some old, articles and things that were written back at the time. And so I really had the opportunity to delve back into the history of that. And so what was happening was late 60s, early 70s. There was Ralph Nader and the Nader's Raiders. They were criticizing the FTC for not being aggressive enough and doing something about false advertising. Television, the issue was television advertising at the time, right? Everybody had a television, and it was really the predominant way of reaching consumers. And the perception was that it was just replete with false advertising. And so the FTC was going to get more aggressive and really crack down. And the industry, the advertising industry, the trade associations, ANA, 4As, AAF, really said, hey, maybe we have a problem here that we need to do something about and that we can do something about. And so they got together and created the National Advertising Review Board and its investigative unit, the National Advertising Division. And that's how they framed it at the time, specifically to raise the bar and to bring credibility back to the industry and to show the government that they were able to clean up their own house and keep it in order.
And when you were sitting, during your time at the NAD, when you looked at during your time at the FTC, when you looked at the NAD, did you feel like, yeah, they're living up to their mission? This is working. This is making our jobs easier. This is allowing us to do other things because they've got this under control.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was, it's really interesting to have changed perspectives now. But when I was at the FTC, so we really saw that. And now I get, I start saying we when I'm talking about the FTC. So excuse me, but 30 years dies hard. But when I was at the FTC, we really saw that the NAD had the ability to handle cases and issues sometimes that the FTC couldn't or didn't have the resources for, or just didn't have the bandwidth for, or would take too long to address, basically. And there were certain other types of cases that the FTC just really wasn't going to devote resources to. If they were purely competitive challenges, it's something the advertisers should duke out between themselves. But we really saw the FTC as increasing the impact. The NAD is increasing the impact of the FTC because of the NAD going out there and applying FTC policy and guidance, to a broader range of advertising than the FTC could reach.
And where did you see, at looking back, where did you see the FTC as playing kind of the most important role or the most effective role? Like, where did you see, you're like, yep, we're glad the NAD is doing that. That is like a good sweet spot for them to be. Like, where did you see that as being, back then, like, where did you see it as being the place where, like, yeah, we're glad they're focused on that?
Yeah, one of the things that jumps out the most to me was the low carb craze. Whenever that was, the turn of the century, I don't even remember specifically when it was, but all of a sudden low carb claims were everywhere. And we were looking at them, the FTC, but was really, wanting to know what the FDA thought and making sure that we would be consistent. And the FDA, of course, is notoriously slow on these types of things. But NAD really got in there and started bringing cases, providing guidance on how to substantiate a low carb claim or net carbs or whatever. What do you look at? What's a reasonable consumer interpretation of these claims? And I think it was a perfect example of how self-regulation is more flexible and can react more quickly than the government does. I mean, when you're the FTC, there's tons and tons of due process, right? And there's as aggressive.
There's certainly questions about that right now, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, but okay. Internally, there's many layers of review. You think about the impact. Imposing a regulation or bringing a case in a law enforcement action is very different than doing something on a self-regulatory basis.
One of the things that the NAD has always talked about, one of the things that I think was sort of seen as sort of the necessary kind of pieces of the creating the NAD system was transparency, right? We have to tell people what's going on, and then this sort of notion that if you don't comply, we're going to refer to most likely the FTC. And the FTC is a big supporter, and they're definitely going to promptly look at the referrals and address them when appropriate. And do you feel like the stick is still important? Do you feel like that the role that the NAD? Do you think the NAD's influence would be any less effective if there wasn't a threat of that the regulators would back up what the NAD is saying?
I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. It's like proving a negative or something, but I do think it's historically it's been very important. And historically, the FTC has always paid close attention to the NAD referrals and given them priority and really tried to make sure, the goal would always be for the company to participate in self-regulation, right? Go back to the NAD. But I think and for many companies, maybe the stick isn't that important. But there are others where, I can think of examples where, they definitely did not want the FTC investigating them. And once they got to the FTC and saw that referral process was real, they decided, okay, maybe we'll go back to self-regulation. So it may be that it's not always necessary, but I think it's important that it be there.
Yeah, but I guess maybe my view, which is hinted at by my question, is it feels to me like NAD plays such an important role and is so established now and so highly respected that the reality, at least certainly for responsible advertisers, they're going to listen to the NAD. regardless. And if they really believe that there's not an FTC problem, that maybe that threat of enforcement is not as important as it once was. But so what's it like now? Is the FTC as kind of outspoken in its support of NAD in the way that it's been in the past?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And, folks that are there are kind of, following the process that I set in place basically when I became the head of ad practices to really have a process for handling NAD referrals. And everything we've seen, for example, Serena Viswanathan, who's the head of ad practices now, speaking at the NAD conference last September, is very supportive. We still see, I mean, the fact is there's been way fewer referrals over the last couple of years. They've dropped precipitously. I'm not sure of the reason for that. I don't know if it's because, given how aggressive the FTC has become, that companies are more leery of being referred there than ever before. But they're very appreciative of the role that self-regulation plays, and they understand the importance of being that regulatory backstop for NAD.
So what do you think? And I guess, just focusing on, I guess, NAD and Kiru, what do you think is the most important role for them to be playing right now? I mean, if it was created to respond to this sort of perceived lack of, effectiveness of the FTC in the early 70s or whatever, and the sort of sense of needing to clean up the industry, what's kind of the role? What's the most important role for NAD and Kiru to be playing today?
So I think it's really applying FTC law and policy and guidance and expanding the impact of the FTC's work, because the FTC has limited resources. No matter how aggressive it may be, it still has limited resources and can only do so much. And but NAD and Kiru, I mean, Kiru does have its advertising guidelines, and so some instances will go beyond what the FTC would require, what the law would require. But otherwise, we are really trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the FTC, in essence, in terms of, okay, interpreting how an ad would be interpreted, or what's a reasonable basis, what kind of substantiation should the advertiser have. And so I think it's a really important opportunity for we help expand the FTC's work, but also it's an opportunity for actually to embrace the original purpose, of self-regulation, which was to show that the industry can regulate itself, that it isn't only the threat of government regulation or government law enforcement that causes people to do the right thing, that many advertisers do want to do the right thing, right? They may not always agree on what that is, but with guidance, then they can do it. And so I think that, there's a real opportunity for especially with the mainstream companies who are really, they care about the reputation, they're trying to do the right thing, to really use the self-regulatory process to keep others in line as well.
So the system, the sort of NAD Kiru procedures, particularly NAD procedure, were the same for decades, literally. And then over the last bunch of years, NAD went through, some pretty significant revisions to its challenge procedures in terms of adding the SWIFT practice, adding the more complex track. Maybe could you talk a little bit about kind of, why these changes were made and how that sort of changed the way in which NAD works?
Yeah, so the SWIFT. So the first thing that we did was we did adopt this track called Fast Track SWIFT, and that was based on conversations we had with companies and law firms that regularly used NAD, where there were some concerns that the decisions were taking too long, and so you'd have misleading claims in the marketplace, and wasn't there a way to address them more quickly? So we established SWIFT to address certain narrow types of advertisements and have the decision done within 20 business days. And we created that process that we thought, that is SWIFT, but still having fair, and the ability of each side to be heard. And with complex track, it was sort of similar, but on the other end, where some cases were so complicated, involved so many difficult substantiation issues or ad interpretation issues that the normal deadlines that NAD set were very difficult to meet, and greater flexibility was needed. And so the complex track was created to add that flexibility.
And what's next? Like, what do you see as the next big thing in terms of innovations?
So I think we're going to continue to enhance, certainly Swift as needed. One of the things that we're thinking about doing is to allow implied claims in the Swift process. When it was set up, it was just express. It had to be an express claim, so there would be no issue of an interpretation. But as you know, as an advertising lawyer, the line between what's express and what's implied isn't always that clear. It's a little bit of a continuum. And so we're thinking about being a little bit more flexible there, the types of Swift claims that could be resolved. And we also created a disclosure track for Swift where the issue is only the adequacy of the disclosure. That's a very simple issue. Well, a single issue there.
So, just to talk about maybe some specific issues, it seems like one of the issues that, one of the issues that we've all been talking about a lot, particularly over the last 3 years or so, has been issues related to diversity inclusion and stereotyping and what more we can all be doing to address, systemic racism in society. And, I know that, KRU for as long as I can remember had some provisions related to stereotyping, but then KRU updated its guidelines to be more explicit. And then, NAD went through a thoughtful process to figure out how to incorporate it in its procedures as well. And it would be interesting just to hear a little bit about sort of, what your thinking is in terms of the role that, both NAD and KRU can play in this space.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right in terms of the timing. With KRU, we were overhauling the guidelines anyway to bring them into the digital age. And this was 2020, and you had the movement after the murder of George Floyd, and this was really top of mind, and the time was right there to take the stereotyping and diversity and inclusion provision out of the aspirational part of the guides and move it into something, a provision that you could actually bring a case against. And similarly for NAD, the U.S. is, maybe the only, or certainly one of the only countries in the world that doesn't already have this type of provision that it acts against. And so, but of course, NAD's jurisdiction is limited to inaccurate or misleading claims. So we had to think about what we could work with in that framework. And but the thought was that self-regulation is an opportunity for companies to lead, basically, right? And in some cases, it's binding themselves to things that they don't have to. And, take the CFBAI, the food and beverage stuff, right? It's not illegal to market their foods to kids, but they're agreeing not to. And so that's taking a leadership role. And the thought here was that this was an opportunity for advertisers to take a leadership role as well. And so we had a lot of discussions with our stakeholders, with our national partners. It's over 100 different companies and law firms who support self-regulation, and talked about, could we not really expand NAD's jurisdiction to go beyond misleading advertising, but to consider misleading stereotypes and negative stereotypes as the type of claim that the NAD could pursue.
So KRU has had a case or two dealing with kind of the new provisions. At least one of them was a monitoring case, which unfortunately I'm not too familiar with. And then, but I don't believe that the NAD has brought a case yet or had a case yet. And I'm wondering, do you see this as an area where, I think we've seen over time, NAD or the BBB system has kind of made some decisions. We really want to get into this issue. Let's look for some cases, some monitoring cases to bring. Do you see this sort of stereotyping thing as we're going to wait for a challenge here, or we want to bring some cases and we really want to lead this conversation?
Yeah, I know. I do think it's an opportunity for monitoring, and I'm not sure how many challenges we'll see in the space. And one of the purposes of NAD doing monitoring is to challenge types of claims or issues that might not be the subject of a competitor challenge if they need to be addressed. So I do think it's an opportunity for monitoring, most likely.
Yeah. Um, Another issue that has long been on the NAD's agenda has been kind of the use of endorsements and influencers and kind of all of these transparency issues that we've been struggling with now for, I don't know, 20 years. And I think one of the roles that NAD has really played, and you touched on this, was that the FTC pretty much updates its guidance once every 10 years. Though certainly in the endorsement space, you came up with FAQs that were updated and provided new guidance, and and then there were cases and things like that. But that there was an important role that the NAD kind of played along the way to the NAD was certainly the first one to say things in a lot of different areas about use of influencers online. So I guess my question is with the FTC revisiting the endorsement guides right now. So in the U.S., the FTC issues all this guidance, and one of the most ones that advertisers look at most closely is the FTC guidance on use of endorsements and testimonies and advertising. FTC is in the middle of a process to revise the guides, and I guess the question is from where you're sitting now, what do you see are the most critical issues that need to be addressed?
Yeah, so, and you're right. I mean, when you asked earlier about one of the things I did observe when I was at the FTC was the NAD taking the lead on guidance on influencers, bloggers, native advertising, et cetera, really getting out there more quickly than the FTC could. And right now, I think what we would like to see from the FTC in the endorsement guides is tackling the issue of endorsements in advertising directed to children. When we updated our KRU guidelines, again, we tried to channel the FTC as best we could in putting provisions in there addressing endorsements and influencers and whatnot. But I think it would be really helpful to have specific guidance from the FTC on those issues, especially the kind of videos, the influencer videos that you see. I think knowing what disclosures the FTC thinks are or are not adequate would be very helpful.
Anything else? Any other big issues you feel like are critical to be addressed?
Well, I just, in general, and we did file a comment with the FTC, I think more examples of almost everything is really helpful, but clarifying issues, especially in affiliate advertising and product reviews. And the FTC has put out some guidance there as well, some informal guidance, but the product review websites and the adequacy of disclosures there, I think the NAD is taken on in cases, and I think would benefit from hearing directly from the FTC.
Well, what do to take a little detour, you mentioned disclosures, I think that it's pretty hard to find a FTC case where the FTC gave a thumbs up to a disclosure that an advertiser used. Whereas I think NAD, is, more open to the idea that, a disclosure that meets kind of generally accepted standards of slapping it at the bottom of an ad has the potential to provide some degree of disclosure. And with the FTC also rethinking its .com disclosure guidelines as part of rethinking so many things, like what role do you think disclosures have to play in advertising today? I mean, it seems to me like the world is very complicated. There are a lot of issues. There's a level of under and over disclosure that's happening in advertising that makes everything more complicated. But what do we do? Like I think that what do we do on this whole disclosure point? It seems like there was the grand experiment of the .com disclosures, the first guidance that came out however many 20 years ago, where the FTC kind of said, hey, there's a lot of possibilities here. We've got this big new world where we're going to use all this technology to allow people to disclose better and more effectively. And then you come 20 years later and they're like, nah, didn't work. In fact, all those techniques basically made advertisers use disclosures less effectively. So what do you think is the next? Where are we going with disclosures? How should advertisers be thinking about that? How's that for the philosophical question?
Yeah. Okay. What I think is that you have to distinguish between disclosures that are necessary to prevent a claim or an ad from being misleading, and disclosures that just provide additional potentially useful information, because I think they play really different roles, and they're treated differently, and the FTC and NAD treat them differently. Disclosures that are necessary to prevent an ad from being misleading, of course, are regulated most strictly. But I personally think
Hey, Mary, I think you froze up there for a second. Let's see if you come back. Uh-oh, we lost Mary. Oh, Mary's coming back. Okay.
okay.
Mary?
I'm here.
Are you back?
Yeah. Can you
I can
hear
hear
me?
you. So we lost you at, I personally think.
Okay. Okay. What did I say? I said I personally think that we would all be better off if advertisers would, to the extent they could, include the information in the disclosure, if it's necessary to prevent deception, in the main claim itself, and not rely on a separate disclosure. To just qualify the claim, limit the claim, modify the claim to include that information, because it is really hard to do an effective disclosure. And if the claim itself is limited in some way, because maybe it only applies to certain types of products or certain types of consumers or under certain conditions or what have you, it's often possible to include that kind of information in the claim itself. And then you don't need a separate disclosure. Consumers, when you think about how consumers consume ads, how closely are they paying attention? Are they distracted? What else is going on? You can't expect them to be reading all this fine print. And that's why the FTC doesn't like fine print, right? And so, so again, it makes a difference if it's just additional useful information versus something that without this information, this ad's going to be misleading.
What I don't know. I this is one of the topics that's really interesting to me, but why not though? Why can't we expect consumers to actually read the whole ad? Like why is the system? I realize it's not the law. I'm just being philosophical here. But I mean, the world has changed a lot. I don't know. Consumers are more sophisticated, at least I would argue that they are, or at least they're certainly more familiar with technology than they were 20, 30 years ago. I mean, is there, particularly now that you're sitting on the self-regulatory side or whatever, I mean, isn't there an argument that maybe that we can expect a little bit more of consumers to take a little bit more care when they review an ad, or do we really have to just take them as they come?
I would say take them as they come. That I mean, that's just because that's how the world is, right? And if the point of the ad is to convey information to consumers, to hopefully make them make a purchase or a brand decision, then you just have to accept them the way they are. And I don't know if they're getting more sophisticated or not. I think that there's lots more information out there, lots more sources of information. Certainly, consumers have more of an ability to research and find things out. But there's also a ton of misinformation out there as well, right? Fake reviews and the like. So it's really hard. So I just think that it's possible that, hey, advertisers, they have tremendous creativity, right? That's like, a lot of what they're about in how they're reaching consumers. And I think applying some of that creativity and conveying the message in a way that doesn't need a bunch of mouse print would be a really good thing.
So another big issue that I think we're all going to be spending a lot of time talking about over the next couple of years, since it's what we're talking about right now, is environmental claims and sustainability. And the FTC is, of course, engaged in a review of the green guidance as well. I guess I would love to hear from where you sit, particularly from having obviously been deeply involved in those guys over the years as well. What do you see as the most challenging issues right now, or what are the ones we really need to be focused on?
Yeah, so I think the claims around climate change, so carbon neutral, net zero, those types of claims, sustainability claims, I think they're challenging because they're really difficult to measure and difficult to substantiate appropriately. But they're everywhere, right? They're very popular claims, and I think they really need FTC guidance.
One thing a lawyer said to me recently, which I thought was an interesting take on environmental marketing, was it seems like puffery is a principle that applies to every area of advertising law except environmental marketing. And it seems like if you said, our car makes you feel great, you'd be fine. If our car is the best one out there, you'd be fine. But if you say our car is eco-friendly, you'd be making a false claim that requires substantiation. Do you think what's your response there? Is puffery just doesn't exist in green marketing, or is there something special about general environmental benefit claims that's just different than other types of puffing that happens in advertising?
Yeah, I think it's different. I care a lot about this. I worked on the first FTC green guides, back in 1992. And so it's been a long time. And I really do think that when you're making a claim about the environment, it's different because that is a specific claim. And what is the point of saying earth-friendly or eco-conscious or eco-friendly or what have you, if you don't have something specific that you can point to that this is why you're making the claim? Because it's not puffery, it has to mean something. Otherwise, it is greenwashing, like it is like the definition of greenwashing to me. And so I think that there's very limited latitude for puffery in that space. I mean, that there's got to be some concrete, tangible benefits or attributes behind the claims.
So in a fireside chat that I did with Guy Parker, for people, so Guy runs the self-regulatory system in the UK and also is currently the president of ICAS, which is the sort of International Council for Advertising Self-Regulation, which is kind of a relatively newly created coordinating organization for self-regulation around the world that kind of allows self-regulatory organizations to more easily talk to each other and collaborate, but also to sort of help spread the message and support the development of advertising self-regulation. And so one of the things that Guy said to me in a chat like this was, he thinks that preventing deception in environmental marketing is not enough, and that we actually need to be looking at the ways in which brands promote consumption and responsible consumption, and that that self-regulation needs to look at the ways in which advertisers, it's not just about deception. It's about we actually have to have a more responsible product ecosystem in a way. Do you think there's a role there for NAD to play, or in terms of I think if you show somebody sitting in their kitchen drinking water out of a water bottle, as opposed to just getting water from the faucet, or you show somebody driving to their friend's house that's only a block away as opposed to walking down the sidewalk, do you think that there's a role for NAD to play there in terms of hey, maybe it's deceptive to show people that that's an appropriate way to behave in the context of climate change?
So, I think it's a really interesting discussion, but I think that is an area where the NAD is probably unlikely to kind of go out ahead of where the advertising industry is. I think if the advertising industry were willing to be held to certain standards there, if they wanted to, that would be one thing. But I kind of don't see. I think that it would be much more difficult to interpret ads that way and to really make the judgments about whether or not the ad is misleading in some way in terms of what it is encouraging, activities that are bad for the environment. But I can understand other countries could do it differently, and that is one of the beauties of self-regulation, is that it's adapted to the the norms and priorities of each country. So
That's right. And
yeah.
And many of the systems are very code-based systems which allow for that. So maybe just to talk about that for a second, BBB is a member of ICAS, or NAD is somebody's a member of ICAS.
BBB National Programs is.
Right. Yeah. What do you see? What do you see as the role that, or a productive role that ICAS could play, or what do you think is some of the values or important benefits of having advertising self-regulation, collaborating with each other, talking to each other around the world?
Yeah, so I participate. I'm the representative from BBB National Programs in ICAS, and I think it's been terrific because it's really basically a community of your peers in essence, the advertising self-regulatory organizations throughout the globe, and it's a way to share issues that come up. How are you handling this? What are you seeing where you are? Sharing information, sharing resources, both informal and formally, webinars and stuff like that. But basically, it's a community of advertising self-regulators. And it's really pushing on advancing the case for advertising self-regulation around the globe. I mean, there's SROs in many, many countries, but it's not everywhere. And in some countries, they may be, it's not as robust as in others. And ICAS is really making the case and the benefits of advertising self-regulation, not only for consumers, but for the participating industries and for the government. Like I've talked a lot, I think it benefits the FTC here. So I think it's really, kind of making the case for why there should be robust advertising self-regulatory processes everywhere, and that every player in the advertising ecosystem should participate. And that's been something that's been an emphasis the last couple of years, is having the digital players involved as well.
The last topic before we wrap up, and it's been so interesting and fun to talk about this. NAD self-regulation has changed and evolved over the years, but not as much as it seems like the FTC has changed and evolved over the last couple of years. Commissioner Wilson yesterday had, kind of quite an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, and there's been a lot of, strong dissents and concurring opinions and pretty public debates on and offline about the approach and the way in which the FTC is handling cases. What's your take on what's going on? Yeah, I'd love to. What's your take on what's going on right now?
Yeah, well, it is interesting to watch, and I will say in some respects, I think it's kind of like a pendulum, and that's happened with the FTC over the years, over the more than a century of its existence, in terms of how active or less active it's been. I refer to Ralph Nader and Nader's Raiders around the late 60s, early 70s, and the FTC was derided as the little old lady of Pennsylvania Avenue. And then the FTC became more active, and then during the 80s, especially the second half of the 80s, did very little, and then became more active again in the 90s. And so I think that, so it's partly that. And I think the current leadership, I think there was a real sense that, or a feeling that the FTC could and should do more than it had been doing, and taking more aggressive stances. And, you can argue about whether that's true. I'm very proud of the work that we did when I was there. But I can, I understand the concerns that, hey, there's lots of practices were permitted that shouldn't have been, that authorities were given to the FTC by the Congress that weren't used, and it's time to step up and do them. I don't know how it's all going to shake out. I love the FTC. It was a wonderful place to be, and I'm just, I hope that eventually it gets back to maybe the right equilibrium where people feel, okay, you're really, you're on the right path in terms of the level of enforcement and activity.
One of the things that always struck me was the level of remarkable continuity of kind of approach, regardless of administration, right? I mean, it really felt like, whether it was, I mean, sure, there were differences in focus and there were things that were done differently, but you didn't go from Republican to Democrat president and suddenly it was like bombshell, like, oh, we're going to approach this issue differently, we're going to think about things differently. And it does feel like we're at a moment now where we're thinking about things differently, both in terms of maybe the kinds of remedies that the commission's looking for, but also kind of an enforcement approach or kind of a regulatory approach. And I guess one of the things that makes me a little nervous is the sort of notion, particularly in this incredibly quickly evolving world of this push toward rulemaking, right? And this notion of, if we suddenly take all of this guidance and turn it into rules, are we going to be able to adapt to changes over time? Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was there, we always thought of ourselves more as a law enforcement agency than as a regulatory agency, so really different from, say, the FCC or the FDA, primarily law enforcement. And yes, the FTC had rules, but there weren't that many. It was when Congress told us to do them, by and large. And so this is a different approach. And I can see it from both sides, because I can see the value of rules in providing clear boundaries for what is and is not acceptable, what does and does not violate the law, gives the commission the ability to get civil penalties and redress for consumers in ways that it can't now, and especially with types of actions that it wouldn't be able to get a monetary remedy at all. Let's say a poorly disclosed influencer thing, something like that. And so from that standpoint, it's really increasing the effectiveness of the FTC in encouraging compliance with the law and going after law violators. But I also understand that a lot of these areas are gray. And believe me, especially in the area of endorsements, the conversations we had when we were updating the FAQs, for example, to give guidance about, oh my gosh, where do we fall on the line here? Is this or is this not problematic? Did they need a disclosure or not? Is this disclosure good enough or not? So codifying all of that, ups the ante considerably, obviously. Just, the FTC, it's good in the standpoint of, okay, we can get penalties, but that means now the companies are subject to penalties and it makes it much riskier. And I can see where it's very difficult in gray areas to have that kind of have a bright line rule that with the consequences of monetary penalties. So I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there's a middle ground where a rule where there are certain very obvious issues, but some of the gray areas won't be addressed, and those will continue to be addressed on a case-by-case basis instead of under a rule.
Well, we got ICAST meeting in Istanbul. Are you coming? Are you coming to Istanbul?
Yes. I'm very excited to be going to Istanbul. Yep.
I am too. I'm looking forward to that. Well, anyway, thank you for doing this. It was super interesting and a lot of fun, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff. I enjoyed it.
All right, take care, Mary.
Bye.
Bye.